You can't ignore China. You can't contain it. You can't make it go away.
So-called engagement policy, democratizing China by incorporating it into the global economy, was now widely considered to be failed. But how do you look back on the U.S. policy toward China?
Frankly, they worked with the U.S. and others on sanctions with Iran and North Korea. They helped me in Sudan and Darfur. But I think that when Xi Jinping took office, you started to see a move away from some of those policies. In the first years of his time, until 2013, 2014, they did pick up on some of the reform ideas that we had worked with them at the World Bank on. But then with some of the market shocks in 2015, I think you started to see him move towards more controlled system. So on the one hand, we need security deterrence so as to prevent any aggression. On the other hand, we need to continue to work with China on issues, whether they be climate change, pandemics, the international economy. And finding that balance, I think, will be is the challenge of our era. When President Biden ran for office, some of his advisors said engagement failed. But in reality, if you look at the Chinese cooperation on areas like non-proliferation policy, economics, some environmental issues, engagement didn't fail. That was the point of the responsible stakeholder, was to say, China has benefited from the international system. You need to carry some responsibilities. Frankly, I think under Trump, we weren't so responsible, and I think China hasn't been so responsible. And right now, you've had a movement towards sort of policies that have been more focused on sort of issues at home and less concerned about the overall international benefits.
So, more economic policy toward China. The Biden administration trying to adopt a policy of small yard high fence or de-risking instead of decoupling. So, would this be a really feasible policy?
I think the danger is that when a government starts to put on export controls, the devil is in the details of how they apply those. So let me give you a good example. NVIDIA is a leading company in terms of semiconductor chips. And so the U.S., working with Japan and others, wants to limit the high-end chips. Well, NVIDIA said, okay, we'll develop a chip that doesn't quite meet those standards so that we can continue to sell into China. This is exactly the difficult work of sort of where one draws the line on technology. And frankly, what economic history would suggest is that you can hold somebody off for 3 or 4 or 5 years by not giving them the technology, but eventually they'll get it. And so the real question is it worth the delay of 3 or 4 or 5 years for whatever security you provide? I can understand the logic, but I tend to believe one has to discipline these limits. So to broaden your question, we've seen a real growth of export controls, sanctions policies, limitations on movement of people and other issues, plus protectionism. And I think these run some risk of hurting the open international economy, which has been the source of Japan's success since World War II, and certainly for the U.S. as well.
I know that you are not the big fan of Donald Trump, but what if next year's presidential election, if Trump win and take in office again, what's happened?
That's a very tough question. I think 2024 will be a very unpredictable year. So you'll see many discussions in the U.S. that assume that Trump has the Republican nomination. I think it's more likely than not, but I wouldn't assume that's locked in. And frankly, Trump seems to be focusing more on vengeance than he is on any sort of policy program. If he does many of the things that he says he's going to do, there'll be resistance. There'll be resistance in Congress. There'll be resistance in the courts. There'll be resistance at the states. So that isn't necessarily encouraging for Japan and others because the United States will be busy internally, but I think that's the most likely scenario.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zoellick.
Okay,
It's
good to see you.
Insightful.